So I'd like to now welcome Danielle Metcalfe-Chenail up to the front. She is at City of Edmonton's current Historian Laureate, and as I mentioned, her work has focused on the Camsell Hospital. There's a little bit of information about the work she's done with the blog called The Ghost of Camsell in your program, and I'm sure she'd be happy to ask or answer any questions that you have throughout the day about that. So welcome, Danielle.
Thank you so much for coming today. As many of you know, this is something that is very close to my heart, and unfortunately I had to move to Texas a couple of months ago, so I was so pleased that I was able to come up and be part of today's symposium, that the Heritage Council and the Alberta Foundation for the Arts and all the wonderful people here in this room are making this happen and bringing all the right people into the same room together to talk about this. Now, I was telling Sarah, my colleague, I have 20 slides and only supposed to be in 30 minutes, but I'm going to just kind of whip through them. I'm not going to editorialize too much or analyze. There's going to be a lot of that great in-depth discussion by the presenters after the coffee break. And this is just to kind of give everyone a broad overview of the site and some visuals, so that maybe if you're not as familiar with the Camsell's long history, and because it does span almost 100 years, that you've got some kind of visual cues, so that when people are talking about something like the Jesuit College, you can go into that back 90. And we do have a short video at the end as well, so I'll get Miranda to help me at the end, and hopefully technology is on our side today. So as Miranda and Minister Fian just mentioned, this is about reconciliation, and it is about many different voices. And over the last year that I've been committing my work to the Camsell's memory and legacy, I've been talking to a lot of different Edmontonians and people from across the country. And they say very different things about the place. And so part of reconciliation, I think, is reconciling that very complex history, not dumbing it down, not making it more palatable, but really getting at the heart of different individual experiences and understanding that sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it's both, kind of like parenthood maybe. So most of my research with the Ghosts of Camsell project actually focused on the tuberculosis years and the provincial years. So for today, I got the chance to go back even further. I had this kind of vague idea of the original history, but I didn't realize that the Camsell Hospital, which sits in the Inglewood neighborhood in Edmonton, not that far from where we are today, was originally just adjacent to the Hudson Bay Company reserve lands. And that it was John Norris who purchased that land. He worked for the HBC. He was actually from northern Scotland and came over to Canada. And that he married a Métis woman, a local Métis woman, called, I'm always going to forget her name, but her last name is Plant. And they set up farmlands there, and one of the first stores, community gathering places outside of Fort Edmonton. And their son, Malcolm Norris, became one of the strongest Métis leaders fighting for Indigenous rights out of Saskatchewan, from what I understand. I'm still wading into this. This is very surface level, and you can always feel free to come up and correct me at break time. I always say that. So from there, in 1913, John Norris gave the land to the Jesuit college that was built. So my understanding is the Highlands of Scotland is quite Catholic, and that he was quite indebted to the Jesuits, and so he donated this land to them at the urging of some of his Catholic confrères, we might say. He was quite close with Lacombe, that many of us know, who's an oblate. And so this was set up for quite a long time, and it was a live-in college. And so at the height in the 1920s, there was space for 300 people to live there and to study. Pardon me. And my dad went to a Jesuit college actually back east. He didn't have the greatest things to say. They were pretty strict. So I can understand that this, they probably got a good quality education in terms of Latin and English and French and the religious studies, but they were probably not spared the rod. And so from there, during the Depression, a lot of Albertans, Canadians were suffering with the downturn in the economy. If we think that we're in a slump right now, it's nothing compared to back then. And so people were finding it harder to send their sons to this college and couldn't afford to pay tuition. So the college decided that it was going to close its doors and it wanted to sell its infrastructure. And lo and behold, it was sold to the federal government, who seconded it to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And if any of you are, possibly aviation history buffs, you might have talked about this with the Northwest staging route out of Edmonton, where people were they were ferrying airplanes from Edmonton all the way up to Alaska, where they would be turned over to the Russian Air Force. Well, along the same time, they were also building the Alaska Highway, of course. And so these engineers, which I think is a really interesting part of our diverse and inclusive history, a lot of these corps were actually Black Americans who were sent into Canada. And many of them, if you see the archives in the Yukon, they were not prepared for the winters. And they faced quite a bit of racism in the Yukon, which was still segregated. So that is a part of the Camsell history and Edmonton's history that could, if any of you have some grad students or honor students who want to look into something, there's something for them. So they were, as you can see here, you have that Jesuit college, the brick building in the middle, and they brought in all this California redwood from the States and built all these temporary buildings all around it. And those ended up becoming quite important for when, after the war, or at the tail end of the war, the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps took it over to help start treating some of the veterans from the Second World War who were coming back from overseas with tuberculosis, because it was an incredibly infectious disease that affected people in the war as well. And I actually saw one stat that the number of people who died from tuberculosis during the war years was higher than those killed in combat, which I thought was really interesting. Don't ask me for a citation on that. There's no footnote right now. But it was, obviously they had 300 beds, 300 rooms. There were only, as far as I can tell, a few dozen veterans that were occupying the space. And so when the Canadian government started sending people around looking for places that could turn into sanatoria for Indian Health Services, they said, oh, the Camsell would be perfect. Let's do it. There was a little bit of Edmonton at first wasn't too sure about the Jesuit College for some of the people in the neighborhood, and there was actually quite a bit of opposition to creating an Indian hospital in the center of Edmonton as well. I'm not going to get into that because I've got 20 slides and a video, but that is something to kind of include in the picture. And it was named after this gentleman, Dr. Charles Camsell, who at the time was retiring from the Department of Mines and Resources. And so he wasn't a medical doctor, he was a geologist. But from something that I read, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the sources said that Indian Health Services actually fell under the Department of Mines and Resources for quite some time, which is kind of tells you something. So in 1945, they started setting it up, and it officially opened in 46. And so you can see how the Jesuits College has been transformed into the Indian Hospital, and then the Redwood buildings were actually used as wards. And so people were put there. And from my understanding, it was mostly male patients that were in those exterior wards. And here's one of the photos of many of some people, some of the first patients who were spending time at the Camsell from all over the place. And I'd have to double check the information, because one of the things Miranda and I and some of the other folks in this room have found is often the names aren't attached to the photos, either in the archives or in the newspaper accounts. And so that might be something that we could talk about this afternoon, is trying to bring those names and photos and giving those back to their families. I know I said I wouldn't editorialize, but I'm just going to put some food for thought out there too. And so, yes, very much so, as Minister Feehan said, for a good 20 years, the Camsell Hospital was primarily a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients. Really from the 40s until the late 60s, that seemed to be its primary focus. And it was an epidemic, as many have noted, for many reasons. And if any of you have read Colonizing Bodies and some of the researchers' work that are here today, it's a complex story, and I think a lot more complex than the federal government or mainstream Canada believed at the time. And so people were sent from all over, mostly the Western Arctic and Alberta. And the way that I connected first with the Camsell was actually 2 years ago when I was doing research for my last book about northern aviation, and I heard about these Arctic X-ray tours. That growing up in Canada, being immersed in contact relations, Indigenous histories, I had never heard of X-ray tours or Indian hospitals. And when you have that kind of gut moment where you're like, this is something that's really important, I can't let this go. And so I put way too much in my book. My editor cut it all out, pretty much except for a few bits, because I was going, a little bit on a tangent. But I said, this is something that I really have to keep going with. And so really, they called them Easter tours, a lot of the bush pilots, because they would go up around this time of year because it was good conditions for flying. They would set up at the missionary posts and the HBC posts and have people line up to do x-rays to look for incidents of tuberculosis. And so one of the things that I found so interesting as a researcher was that it really brought so many of the things that I'd been working on together. It brought together aviation, missionaries, the North, Indigenous peoples, Edmonton, and it really is a very, very interconnected story. And so these are some images from the hospital itself, and as some people here know firsthand, and others have learned, sometimes people were brought to the Camsell for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and I just heard this morning of somebody that was there for 11 years. You gotta pause and think about that for a second. There was one woman that I read about called Elizabeth Beaver who was institutionalized from her young childhood for 18 years because of her tuberculosis and the rest cure that they used at the time. And so for me, this has so many implications, of course, for the interactions that people had. Of course, there were beautiful friendships, and I've heard some wonderful stories around that. A lot of people gave birth at the Camsell. Sometimes they arrived pregnant. I've been told sometimes they developed that condition on site. So even though they tried to keep men and women quite separate, and even children separate, it sounds like people are people. They find a way. And there was a lot of interaction with the local community. There were charity groups, schools. A lot of people that I spoke with came in as children to try and put on entertainment for patients. I think you'll hear later on about occupational therapy and rehabilitation and different things. But of course, as Minnie mentioned before, there was loneliness, there was language barriers, there were so many things going on. And the historical record so far, I think, is incomplete. There's a lot of us trying to make it more complete right now. And there's an incredible amount of information that's available in the archives and through oral histories. And so one of the things I did before I moved to Texas was photocopy madly. And luckily with the Provincial Archives and City of Edmonton Archives, they've really opened up their collections to me. And I've photographed every single page of every single Camsell Arrow and pictorial review that they have, and tried to, I have got 2 or 3 boxes of photocopies from the Provincial Archives from multiple different collections and fonds, if you want to get fancy with the archival terms, which I know some of you do. So it is, a really interesting place, and there was a lot going on at different times. So, if you look at the Camsell of people coming down, it was also used to train people going to the north. And so I think that's really interesting to think about. All the RCMP officers that were being stationed in the north, they were learning a lot about what they might encounter and how they should act and the kinds of, first aid and medical treatment that they could give at the Camsell. So it could be a real spawning ground for ideas and information moving out throughout the rest of Canada. And then there were some internal programs, because people were there for so long, they needed, and in the words of some of the nurses on staff and the rehabilitation people, they needed things to keep them busy, try to keep their spirits up. They were able to create and sell objects that Sarah will talk about, to sell in the gift shop, that then made its way out into the community. And from what I understand, it was a good way to make money to buy your cigarettes. You got to have your comforts in life, right? Even if you're in the hospital. Some of these programs were quite short-lived. Again, I think it's because of the trajectory of the hospital. Because by the late 1960s, they were looking at this brick building and all these Canadian redwoods, and they were saying, okay, this is kind of a fire trap. It's not safe. There's a lot of problems for the patients and the hospital staff members. Let's try to make this a better site. And of course, that's right around Expo 1967, Expo 67, Canada's centenary. There's a lot of big projects. And so it sounds like probably not unlike today, a lot of debate about price tags and things like that between the provincial and the federal governments over who should pay what and whether this might go ahead. But finally, by around 1967, this provincial hospital, this is of course a very recent picture, that's the kind of schematic that they were planning to do, that this became a reality. And then the way that the federal government and the provincial government and everyone kind of framed it was, this was a gift to the North. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, and we can unpack that later if you want to. So it was still under federal control, though. It was still the federal government that was controlling it at this point. And while at the same time, if any of you have seen this, I've never seen it firsthand. I've grabbed some of these photos, but I've been told that Jean Dubb, who's over there, is preserving this, and that it will be preserved and kept for the future. But this was a mosaic by a very famous mosaic artist in the 1960s, Svoboda, and he created this, and it seems like everybody you talk to remembers this mosaic and remembers seeing it. And I'm sorry that the images aren't better. Google image search only sometimes yields so much. And another thing that came up was the Charles Camsell History Society. So there were some really dedicated staff members who were there from the earliest days, like Elva Taylor, who wanted to preserve the history. And you might argue, how complete or how biased the history is. It's all fair game. I mean, all of us that are historians know that we're going to be torn down in 20 or 30 years, and sometimes we want to be. But they saw in the 1980s, at which point it was a provincial institution. That switch took place in 1980, that a lot of the old stories might die with the people who were passing away, and they wanted to preserve it. So they formed this society and created a book called The Camsell Hospital that was published, The Camsell Mosaic, that was published in 1985. And they went on to do other work too. So some of you who are talking about the St. Albert Cemetery, and I know some of you are hoping to visit there this weekend, and perhaps we can organize a tour at some point. This is one of the things that historical society took on. There's a very long story. It's all on my blog on ghostsofcamsell.ca. But basically, as you mentioned, Minister Fian, it was right adjacent to where the residential school was, where Poundmaker's Lodge is today. And the Camsell Hospital patients who passed away, the Protestant ones, I was soon to learn, not the Catholic ones, they were buried out here, and often it was the students at the industrial or the residential school who dug and tended the graves. So when the residential school closed in 1968, no more patients were buried there, and it sort of fell into disrepair. So unfortunately, there was a fire that went through, it burned all the crosses, and so people couldn't tell sort of who was there and where exactly they were. And the Historical Society, along with a journalist in St. Albert, started to look at how do we find out who's here? How do we mark it appropriately? And in 1990, they erected a cairn with the names of 91 people who were buried there and as much information as they had. And it is one of the places where patients can go, or loved ones can go, to see friends, family members, and pay their respects. So it is a very interesting story when you talk about sites and remembrance and commemoration. An interesting one to look at. So here's a close-up of the cairn, and that's what the white crosses looked like before the fire went through. And there's a very large boulder with the plaque Aboriginal Cemetery on it that was erected at the same time as the cairn. And from what I understand, that boulder actually was originally in the Northwest Territories, and through the movement of glaciers ended up in Alberta. And so when they went to a U of A prof to see what kind of rock it was, they realized that, wow, this is actually kind of important and significant. So I think we can pause on that for a second. So the hospital honored its 50th anniversary in '95, and at this point, it was just on its last legs. It would close the next year. There were some realizations in the community already that this was a complicated history. I came across an editorial actually by Terry Lusty who's talking about it, and there was a National Film Board documentary that came out where they went to the celebrations and they interviewed people, and it came out called Lost Songs, and it does explore some of the more haunted memories of people who were basically institutionalized, back and forth between residential school and the hospital for many years of their life. And so I mentioned that the St. Albert cairn and the cemetery, it's only Protestants that are there, the United and Anglican patients. And so when I was contacted last year by Kathy and Louisa to find out what had happened to their father and grandfather, we found out pretty quickly he wasn't on that list at the cairn. And then having my father go to a Jesuit college and a lot of lapsed Catholics on my Quebec side of the family, I thought, okay, with a first name like Joseph, maybe he's Catholic. And so we started to do research into where he might be buried. And there's a couple of different locations. There's a cemetery at Enoch that we're still exploring, but we figured out that this is probably where Joseph is buried. And it's you've probably driven by it 1,000,000 times. It's right next to the Anthony Henday, south of the White Mud. There's a huge development there. The land was surrendered by Enoch Nation a few years back, and then they created this lovely monument and dedicated it in 2000. There were elders there, and it says, you have to look at it really closely, and I can put the slide up for you later at lunch or break time if you want, but it says not only is it for our ancestors and some of the chiefs and leaders of our community, but for our Northwest Territory, brothers and sisters who came down here and were buried here. So this was in January. Laura brought me up to the site, and we trudged through snow to our knees, trying to keep my toddler from running onto the highway. So this brings us to today. And I am so hopeful and excited to have you all here today. And I think one of the things, there's Gene Dubb, he said, oh God, there's a picture of me in your slide deck. So it is under development or redevelopment. I know Gene has been involved with a lot of heritage projects here in town, and he's very interested to hear all of this history. I pulled this again off the internet. It looks like that was kind of one of the ideas of how this site might look down the road. And of course, this is a more recent photo, probably taken by one of the trespassers who like to break into the Camsell because it's supposed to be haunted, apparently. And I've heard many different people say that. So I think there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of healing to be done. And all of you here today will hopefully make that happen. So I just have a short video now that actually arrived in my mailbox in Texas last Saturday. It's from the 1940s, and it was at the Provincial Archives of Alberta, and so it took 2 or 3 months for them to take that 16 millimeter film and turn it into the video that you'll see today. It's quite short, but get out your popcorn and open your minds.
On Christmas Day, I saw 3 ships come sailing in on Christmas Day one morning.
Christmas is observed in mansions and cottages, in the churches and in the streets. And for many hundreds of Canadian children, Christmas dawns in hospital wards. To the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital in Edmonton come Indian and Eskimo patients, some of the latter from beyond the Arctic Circle. Most of the children have tuberculosis, and many must spend several years in hospital. This year, our cameraman was invited to their Christmas party. For some of the children, it's the first Christmas away from home, and many of the customs are completely new. But no matter how new the customs, Santa Claus is no stranger to anyone, and there's nothing mysterious about the bag on his shoulder. It's just about as much fun for the hospital staff as for the kids.
Christmas Day, I saw Christmas Day one morning.
So free on Christmas Day, and what was it so ship so free on Christmas Day?
Savior Christ and His Lady on Christmas Day, our Savior Christ and His Lady on Christmas Day in the morning.
They made the sail the ship so free on Christmas Day, They made the sail the ship so free on Christmas Day in the morning.
Oh, they sailed into Bethlehem on Christmas Day, Oh, they sailed into Bethlehem on Christmas Day in the morning. And bells, bells, ring on Christmas Day, and bells, bells, ring on Christmas Day in the morning.
And all the angels went shopping on Christmas Day, and all the angels went shopping on Christmas Day in the morning.
And all the souls on earth shall sing on Christmas Day, and all the souls on earth shall sing on Christmas Day in the morning. And let us all rejoice amain on Christmas Day, and let us all rejoice amain on Christmas Day in the morning.
Many nativity scenes were enacted throughout the country this week. Sick and crippled youngsters enact the tableau again at the Camsell Indian Hospital.
You can clap. I'm fascinated by this video. It's so short, but I can tell you when it arrived in the mailbox, I was really excited. I ran right to my laptop and I grabbed my 3-year-old, and he sat on my lap and watched it with me, and he wanted to watch it over and over and over again. Because I think there's so much for us as adults, people who were at the Camsell, former patients, to think about. And as a child, he just went, why are they in there, Mama? And why do they have, Miranda knows I'm going to cry. Anywho, but anyway, she said that I can entertain a few questions if you have any for me, and otherwise I'm certainly happy to talk with you at the break or at lunch or later in the day.